Man, I'm excited to be here today. There's two arguments I want to make in this brief time. One is that there's never been a more opportune time for local think tanks to lead on economic development. And the second argument I want to make is that those that recognize why that is and invest accordingly will see their impact increase dramatically. But let me start with a little quiz. Who can name this animal? Shout it out. An owl. No, it's a moth. Isn't this a fascinating trick that happens in nature? This moth has evolved to look like an owl. Of course, we wouldn't expect that this moth can function and behave in all the ways that an owl does. And so it only does this as a way to trick predators, but it doesn't really solve the problem that an owl could solve. Well, development economists use this phenomena in nature to help us understand why it is that so many times the right institutions installed in places don't really function and behave as we hope. Now, we know that the institutions of liberal democracy, economic freedom, property rights, free trade, these are the right institutions. They're credited with achieving human rights on an unprecedented scale and prosperity as well. But for some reason, when international experts try to install the right institutions in other places, they don't end up working very often. Why is that? Well, we know this idea of legislation versus the law. When you install a sidewalk, that's the formal legislation of what is supposed to be happening. But the dirt path here is what people actually do in that place. And so understanding why the formal law doesn't match the way people actually live is a key part of understanding how institutional change happens. One institutional scholar put it this way. He said, institutions are both the cause and effect of the people that they govern. What that means is that a functioning institution, something that we would call a best practice, is not the ideal itself. It's a version of the ideal in a particular time and place. And so local knowledge becomes super important if you want to achieve institutional change that sticks. Now at Atlas Network, we have been prioritizing local knowledge for a long time. It's baked into our model. We've been doing this for 40 plus years. But now we're not the only ones who care about this. In fact, what they call localization is the #1 priority of the international aid community right now. And places like USAID are setting big, ambitious targets to try to shift the prerogative and design of intervention and projects away from foreigners to local organizations. Unfortunately, so far it isn't working very well, and there's lots of reasons why this would be. It's hard to redirect a ship of such large size. There's so much bureaucracy. There are a lot of political incentives. We could go on and on. And so the opportunity really falls to people like us in this network, the local think tank leaders and the philanthropists who support them, to get bold and lead on localization, on locally led institutional change. And so that, I think, is the opportunity if we recognize this moment and boldly take our place as leaders in this way. And I want to share what I've been inspired by as I've watched innovative think tanks not just continue to lead development locally, but really take seriously what it means to care about the practical effects of local knowledge in place. So I'm just going to share 3 brief practices that I've seen some of our great think tanks doing that I think help really harvest the true fruits of localization and local knowledge. Prioritization, fieldwork, and co-design. Now, you'll see that all 3 of these, it's not some step-by-step linear process. These can all work together in parallel and in tandem and reinforce each other. So now I'll just briefly go over a few of these ideas. Prioritization. Of course, it would be exciting if you could go to a country or if you're working in a country and just get a whole laundry list of every dream, institution, and policy that you ever wanted. But most of the time, we are identifying priorities and we're advancing strategies to achieve them. And we're doing the hard research to understand their impacts and to make the case. Well, look at this river. If you imagine that the flow of water is like economic freedom, And the faster the flow of water, the more economic freedom there is. Now, any debris or obstruction in the river is going to get in the way of that. It's a barrier to economic freedom, regulation or bad policy or an institution that doesn't really function correctly. Now, removing a twig downstream is certainly not a bad idea. If you identify a priority, there are going to be people who benefit from that change, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's really helpful to do some effort to understand the fuller picture of how different institutions are interacting with each other. So removing a twig downstream may not make a big difference if there's a large obstruction upstream, some boulders and some logs that have fallen in. So this can help us not overpromise that any sort of free market reform is going to change the world. That doesn't mean don't do it. It just means to look in context. And just very briefly, one of the ways to start to do an exercise to think about prioritization, I would recommend this growth diagnostics exercise by Ricardo Hausmann. And you can go and learn more about that or talk to me afterward if that interests you. But again, the idea is to not just think about our wish list in the abstract, but to do some analysis and context about not just what the right policies are, but what policies are going to have the biggest effect right now, given the environment. The second one is field work. This has been really exciting to see how successful think tanks have been in this area. Going out and talking with people on the ground whose lives you hope to see improved by the policies that you care about, start a listening tour, get them involved, see whether they care about these things. We've seen lots of examples where we got the right law passed, and then as it turned out, the people on the ground didn't really trust that it would really help them, or they didn't really want to engage it in a way. For example, a new property rights opportunity to get titling. We make too many assumptions when we don't spend time with the communities understanding their needs. And then the last one, these are great examples of some of the people that our think tanks have identified. And you can see videos about these, and we'll be hearing more about it with some of our other speakers. But again, helping think tanks combine the research with the real lives that help us really understand how things are working. And then the last one, co-design. So this is a quick diagram that kind of brings it all together, that the idea of achieving a stronger institution, again, historically, we've looked on the we know it works line, so maybe property rights in Denmark are really good. So we just try to adopt those. What this helps us see is like, well, start with what we know is possible in a current place and start working there collaboratively with lots of people involved. This practice comes from Matt Andrews, and he works with bureaucracies, but you can also do it with a stakeholder community. And so you can rethink it as the co-design space for new institutional change and new policies is somewhere in the middle. Develop your own version of the ideal for our ideas, rather than just try to adopt the abstract. And so I would just lastly encourage all of us to remember that we are out there trying to build and strengthen institutions of liberal democracy, and that we want owls and not moths. Thank you very much.